The Final Days. This chapter, remembering survival in a Nazi slave labor camp. And this is chapter 23. And it's narrated by me, Carter Banks. Chapter 23. The Final Days. In trying to reconstruct not only the correct sequence, but also the actual dates of events during the last week of the camp, the historian is faced with two difficulties. First, most survivors made no attempt to fit their memories into a precise chronological narrative, much less provide precision and dating. Second, those who did so invariably offer somewhat conflicting sequences. As a result, my attempt to place events in a particular sequence and to space and date them precisely is a hazardous venture at best. The beginning point must be the one date that seems to be reliably fixed. The numbers with which the Strachowitz survivors were tattooed upon arrival in Birkenau were assigned to prisoners on a transport with Polish Jews from the work camps in the Radom district, which arrived on Sunday, July 30th, 1944. This is according to the surviving camp records published in Auschwitz Calendarium, but even this date is not uncontested. The Calendarium is not without dating errors, and one survivor distinctly remembers arriving in Birkenau on his birthday, July 31st. Working backwards, it is my best estimate that the Tartak prisoners had been brought into the main camp on the evening of Monday, July 24th, and Guta Blas's life was ransomed from Baumgarten the next day, Tuesday, July 25th. For those just tuning in, Guta Blas, on the day they were traveling to the new camp when the last one closed, she jumped on a German guard. She ended up getting shot in the head twice, survived, and eventually lived to give this testimony. So that is who Guta Blas is. And continuing. Guta Blas's life was ransomed from Baumgarten the next day, Tuesday, July 25th. On Wednesday, July 26th, the many rumors of impending evacuation were confirmed. A train arrived at the factory and loading began. Then, mysteriously, the action was stopped. Those who had already been loaded were unloaded, and the prisoners were herded back into the factory camp. The initial reaction of the prisoners was jubilation. Prisoners hugged and kissed as if they'd been liberated. No explanation was given, though. Some speculated that either there were not enough train cars for all the prisoners or the tracks had been bombed. After the initial jubilation, panic began to set in, as prisoners realized that evacuation was still imminent. Some prisoners went to the kitchen and grabbed all the remaining food supplies. Others who had been determined to attempt an escape resolved to make their bid that night. Not everyone was even aware of the impending attempt. As news had to be spread by word of mouth, some were not informed or invited. For instance, Esther Kirschenblatt's brother came to her, gave her his bread, and said goodnight without mentioning a word about his impending escape attempt. Others knew but decided against taking part. Many were dissuaded by pleas of family members. Others could not conceive of leaving family members behind. And yet other family members argued, reached different decisions and went their own ways. Some calculated the risk as too high or just became frightened. Joseph Zolno from Pluck decided against an attempt because he did not know the territory. Joseph Tauber feared that if he tried to hide in town, he would be turned over to the Germans, and if he went to the forest, he would be killed by partisans. After all, he noted, if there had been any place to go, he could have escaped from the factory at any time. Joseph Friedensen wanted to join the escape, but could not muster the nerve. Motal Feldstein also wanted to join, but was held back by a premonition he could not explain. Ironically, Those with the best knowledge of local terrain were most likely to be impeded by fears of deserting their families, while those in the camp, without any family ties, were the outsiders and latecomers, least likely to feel confident about escaping into the unknown terrain. Survivors had varying estimates of how many prisoners tried to join the escape attempt, ranging from 150 to 400. Of the 292 surviving witnesses whose accounts form the basis of this study, only 25 testified about their attempt to take part in the escape. It should be kept in mind, however, that some of those interviewed by German judicial investigators may well have participated, but this part of their testimony on escape attempt may have been deemed irrelevant to judicial purpose and therefore was not recorded. In short, participation may have been under-recorded. In my overall collection of testimonies, the plan was simple. An initial group, armed with wire cutters and axes, was to make an opening in the fence. Second, the third groups were ready to rush through, while many others hid under barracks and watched for their chance to join. According to fewer than 11 witnesses, all based on hearsay and not direct participation in the event, contact was made with Polish partisans who were to facilitate the escape by shooting out the searchlights in some versions or neutralizing the watchtowers in others. In one such hearsay account, 500,000 zloty had been paid in advance for this service, with another 500,000 promised afterwards. Against the many hearsay accounts of expected Polish help, one member of the Pluk group had been plotting to escape, testified that he learned much earlier that Polish help was no longer to be expected. When the Polish partisans had learned how many elderly people and children were in the camp, they had changed their plans about liberating it. In 3 accounts, the Ukrainian guards were alleged to have been bribed. In the version of events in which Polish help was expected, the Jews waited through the night for the partisans to shoot out the searchlights or neutralize the watchtowers. But they never came, a fact that is remembered bitterly by a number of survivors as an act of Polish betrayal or deception. Suddenly the lights went off anyway, perhaps due to a nearby air raid. The first group ran for the fence, cut through the wires, and began pulling away boards from the second fence, which made a great deal of noise. Overcrowding at the fence led to panic, and some of the more agile Jews tried to climb the fence instead of waiting for an opening to be made. The Ukrainian guards were alerted by the commotion, turned on the searchlights, and opened fire. Chuna Grinbaum, who was with his sister and the policeman Moshe Herblum, was apparently one of the first to be hit. He suffered a head wound and briefly lost consciousness, but he remembers a stampede of people virtually running over him as he lay there. He then fled back to the women's barracks, where a cousin bandaged the 3-inch gash in his head. The initial fire from the towers did not halt the escape attempt. However, the head of the Ukrainian guards, Willie Skroth, arrived on the scene and tossed a hand grenade into the opening in the fence with devastating effect. Skroth then moved a machine gun into position and opened fire, and ensuing massacre of the first group was virtually complete. Those who were already through the first wire and were now caught between the 2 fences tried desperately to get back into the camp and hide. Many others who had been awaiting their chance to join the breakout gave up any attempt in the face of the hand grenade explosion and the machine gun fire. According to 2 witnesses, 64 prisoners were killed in the escape attempt. While trying to account for the missing, Skroth approached Ida Gutmann and asked her where her brother-in-law Meyer was. She did not know, and he told her that her brother-in-law was not among the dead. By her account, he was among the 7 who escaped that night, 4 of whom were captured and killed almost immediately. In a classic example of the difficulty in using oral testimony for dating, while both Adam Gutmann and his wife, Ida, told the same story concerning Meyer Gutmann's escape in the nighttime breakout attempt in late July. Meyer himself dated the breakout attempt and his escape to April or May of 1944. In fact, Ida Gutmann's estimate of 3 successful escapees was somewhat low. There were at least 5 successful escapees who can now be identified, and there were probably a few more about whom we will never know. One successful escapee, Jacob Saza, credited his pre-war military training for enabling him to slip under the barbed wire without getting entangled and thus avoid the deadly bottleneck where the wire was being cut. Esther Kirschenblatt's brother, who had given her his bread the night before, was not among the dead, and she presumed he initially got away, though he was killed later. Yakov Shavsovitz also made it through the hail of bullets and got away. And according to Shlomo Einesman's daughter, Rosia, her father, who had arranged for a hiding place for the entire family on the outside, was the only one of the family to make it out of the camp, though he did not survive until liberation, while her brother and sister were both killed and her mother was injured in the attempt. The following morning, Thursday, July 27, around 10 a.m., the prisoners were assembled and counted to establish how many were missing. They were marched past the wire, where a number of prisoners, in one estimate 20 to 30, lay badly wounded and were begging to be either helped or shot. But Scroth prohibited any help from being given. The wounded and the dead were to be left for the dogs to eat, he proclaimed. Sesha Bromberger recognized her sister on a pile of bodies. Chuna Grinbaum saw that his sister, the last surviving member of his family in addition to himself, had died just several feet beyond the last fence. In freedom, as he put it. Next to her sat a policeman, Moshe Herblum, groaning with a terrible stomach wound. In several accounts, he was calling, "Kill me, kill me," but the Germans were obviously putting on this grisly display and prolonging the suffering of Herblum and the others intentionally for the deterrent effect. According to most accounts, Baumgarten, very possibly accompanied by the police chief Becker, then arrived at the camp. Though some accounts named Becker, most witnesses stated that it was Baumgarten who assembled prisoners and attempted to give them a reassuring and claiming, even friendly, speech. In one account, he stood on a chair while Jeremiah Wilczek translated his speech from German into Yiddish. He was disappointed with them for the escape attempt, since he had been so good to them. They were indeed going to be sent to another but better camp in the Sudetenland with hot and cold running water. They had nothing to fear, for they were the best workers and much needed. He could not understand how they had gotten such an idea that they had to flee, but he blamed the camp police for instigating panic. Also, one note, breaking back to a few chapters ago, I think we're 2 chapters past where they had just found out by word of mouth about the gas chambers and death camps. They didn't know about that until now. They heard through word of mouth. That was later, I think in the previous chapter, attempted to be put to rest by one of the guards, saying that it was all hearsay and not true, but they're all pretty much, freaking out about that, which anybody would be. Back to the story. He could not understand why or how they had gotten such an idea that they had to flee, but he blamed the camp police for instigating the panic. He then had Moshe Herblum shot by a Ukrainian guard as a warning and deterrent. In one account, Baumgarten displayed a certain degree of humanity. Although he had the order to shoot many more, he had shot only a few of the wounded, specifically those who would not survive in any case. Even as Baumgarten spoke and continuing afterwards, a number of prisoners made further escape attempts in broad daylight. rather than attempting a mass breakout by making an opening in the fence, small groups as well as individuals rushed the fence at different points and either scaled it or slithered under it. Others tried but could not make it. 16-year-old Abramek Nyman, who had been wounded in his leg in the breakout attempt the night before, discovered he was too short to get over the fence. Several others got through at least the first fence, but ran back into the camp when they encountered approaching guards or were fired upon. But at least 4 groups, if not more, reached the forest and made good their escape. Once again, among those participating in the escape were prominent members of the camp elite, the policemen Abraham Wilczek and Shmuel Sizelwai, and Mendel Minkberg, the son of the former head of Jewish Council, were among those who got away. Willie Scroth set off after the largest group of escapees on his motorcycle and returned to the camp claiming that he had caught and shot Abraham Wilczek before he could reach the forest, which turned out to be a false boast. Several narratives explicitly accused the Poles of aiding the recapture of escapees, who were dragged back to camp and killed. In one account, the church bells rang and the priest told Poles it was their obligation to bring back escaped Jews. In another, Poles were offered a reward for using their dogs to track down and bring back Jews. In a third, contrasting account, however, Scroth refused to pay the Poles who brought back any escaped prisoners in clear expectation of a reward. Whatever the disputed role of the Poles, whether in the absence of partisan help or in the tracking down of escapees, one thing seemed clear. In terms of the ratio of escapees to casualties, the breakout attempts can hardly be termed a success. As one man who had hoped to escape but was knocked down by the fence and made his way back into camp stated, his life was probably saved because he did not get out. Another man who did not join the attempt concluded that many more people survived who did not try to escape than who did. The Germans reacted to this flurry of breakout attempts in 2 ways. First, they increased the guard. Among the reinforcements were military police, Felden Gendarmerie, whom the prisoners referred to as canary birds because of the yellow stripes on their uniforms. Second, they collected all the prisoners' shoes and outer clothing in the hope that the Jews would not attempt to escape barefoot and half naked. Also, random fact, they did that in Soviet Russia as well. The gulags, when they went out to work, they would make sure to search for any kind of food, so they didn't have enough food to keep them alive if they had tried to escape. So I think they were only allowed to have like 4 grams. So ridiculous. Back to the story. Among at least a few of the Jewish prisoners, there was a reaction of a different sort. Mistrustful of the camp council and fearing that the camp elite was about to bribe its way out of that last moment, leaving the other prisoners behind to face German reprisal, they put the remaining camp leaders under watch. There were, in fact, no further large-scale breakout attempts, though several women apparently still managed to slip out of the camp that night and join other escapees in the forest. On Friday, July 28, the Strachowitz prisoners were allowed to reclaim their shoes and clothes. Rachel Pioti recalls the devastating effect on her father's morale when someone took the opportunity to steal his treasured pair before he could find them, leaving him with wooden clogs. Unable to walk in them, he felt stripped of his dignity and manhood. In the now heavily guarded camp, machine guns had been set up between the 2 fences. They were trained on the prisoners, who were assembled and left standing for hours in the hot July sun. Some prisoners had dug burrows under barracks in the desperate attempt to hide and evade the evacuation of the camp. When such underground hiding places were discovered, the guards threw hand grenades in or shot them into the bunkers. At least one prisoner who had been wounded in one of the camp breakout attempts and made it back into the camp was now unable to join the assembled Jews and was shot. Joseph Coase approached one of the newly arrived guards, whom he identified as SS, and asked him outright if they were going to be gassed. At first, the guard said the talk of gassing was quatsch, nonsense, that all the Jews were still alive. When Coase pursued the conversation further, the guard finally assured him that while the older ones had to fear death, those capable of work would surely be left alive. A train then arrived on the track that led directly into the factory grounds, and loading began. Most witnesses remembered Becker as the man in charge of the loading, though as in almost every such case, at least one or two named Baumgarten, Scroth, or even the long-departed Kolditz instead. Such conflicting memory and multiple testimonies may be accepted by the historian as an inevitable, but it was especially frustrating to the German judicial investigators who were thereby precluded later from including the lethal consequences of the overloading from becoming a point of indictment against Becker. There is no doubt that most of the train's closed freight cars were terribly overloaded. The women were loaded in different ways, in different cars. From the men, while most were filled so tightly that no one could sit or move about, at least the last women's car had only 75 people in it, but the men's car were packed with 100 to 150 people each. When it proved physically impossible to pack the men any tighter, several open cars were then brought in and added to the end of the train to take the remaining male prisoners. The factory slave labor camps in Strachowitz were now all closed. The journey from Strachowitz to Auschwitz-Birkenau was about to begin. That concludes Chapter 23 of Remembering Survival Inside a Nazi Slave Labor Camp by Christopher R. Browning, narrated to you by Carter Banks.